So we're going to ask the next speaker, to come to the podium, please. So Professor Sioshansi, I'll succeed. And so do you want to introduce the professor? So thank you. And the slides.
Okay, great. So our next speaker now is Ramteen Sioshansi, who's joining us here from Ohio State University. He focuses on energy markets and policy design. Prior to this, he was a postdoc at the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL. And now he is, before this, he was at UC Berkeley, where he got his PhD, and before that at the London School of Economics. So we're very pleased to have Ramteen. Thank you.
All right, so thank you for the introduction and the invitation to join the workshop here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we perceive to be some of the market and policy barriers to energy storage entering the market. So just a brief outline here. I'll just review very quickly what are some of the things that we can do with storage, and then talk about some of the different types of policies that we see. So ranging between difficulties valuing storage, regulatory issues, investment risk, and then conclude with some, I suppose, prescriptions about ways to alleviate some of these issues. So there have been some recent developments in the electricity industry that have increased interest in electricity storage. So it ranges between seeing novel uses and things that we can do with storage that we hadn't thought about before, higher cost of some of the conventional alternatives, restructured markets that we have in place that actually, in some cases, provide pretty good, robust, transparent price signals for the services that storage can provide. And then more recently, in the past maybe 5 years or so, there's been this recognition of the role that storage can play in addressing some of the challenges raised by renewable integration. And so sort of on the research front, what we've seen recently is a lot of focus on technology improvement and demonstration, development of control systems algorithms to actually control storage devices. And then there's been a lot of work looking at sort of valuation studies. What is the value of using storage for this or that, to sort of demonstrate that you can actually get return on that type of an investment. So let me just really quickly run through a few different sort of broad categories of things that we can do with storage. Most of these are hopefully familiar to people who have worked in this area. So energy arbitrage, or time shifting a generation, basically buy, store energy when it's low cost to produce, discharge when it's high cost to produce. Capacity deferral, this is essentially using storage, discharging it. It's in some sense in line with that first application, discharging it when capacity on the system is scarce, and so as a result, you don't need to build more peaking capacity to serve your load. Ancillary services, so this could fall into very, very short time frame regulation control, or you could be talking about longer time frame, slower response contingency reserves. Ramping capability, so this is providing some type of buffer that you can buffer or follow changes in either, in principle, electricity supply or demand over longer time periods. So this could be, you're talking about several hours of ramping capability. Transmission and distribution capacity deferral. So this is similar to the idea of generation capacity deferral. Place storage where there are likely to be binding transmission constraints, charge it when it's not loaded, discharge it when it is loaded, and that alleviates the need to build or upgrade your T&D infrastructure. end user applications. So this could actually be residential, industrial, commercial customers using storage, for example, to manage energy costs if they face time-variant rates, or in some cases using storage to improve power service quality or reliability. And then the seventh that I have listed there is renewable curtailment, which is becoming more of an issue these days. So either through co-location of renewables and storage or something similar, using storage to basically reduce the need to curtail your renewables, which is going to become more of a pressing issue, either due to transmission or due to generator operating constraints. And so we've seen examples of renewable curtailment in the United States, most notably in Texas. Abroad, we've seen it happening now in Spain and Denmark as a result of, in those cases, it's more as a result of the generator operating constraints as opposed to transmission constraints. And then one last thing that's worth noting here is that some of these storage applications can be complementary or substitutes for one another. And so one implication here is that you're going to generally see non-additive values if you're doing multiple things with your storage. So just as a couple of examples here, as I noted before, if you're using storage for this energy arbitrage application, in some sense, if prices and load peaks are coincident, essentially you're also providing that generation deferment service as well. On the other hand, if I'm using storage for ancillary services, what I'm doing right now at this time, because the actual dispatch and the deployment of my storage device is uncertain, may prevent or limit what I can do in terms of charging or discharging my storage an hour from now, because my resource may be deployed to provide regulation or some service right now. So in theory, storage should be able to show up both in traditional and in restructured electricity markets. So in a traditional market, the idea is that the incumbent utility is going to build storage if it's a prudent investment, and of course, in big parentheses, that it can also demonstrate this to whatever the relevant regulatory authorities are. And we've seen this in practice. So in the US, we have about 20 gigawatts of PHS that was built this way in the 60s and the 70s. However, there was quite likely some amount of underinvestment in storage in this period. And that's because the focus at that time was just on those first two applications that I said, basically arbitrage, or what the equivalent of arbitrage is under the regulated paradigm, and firm capacity. So, for example, EPRI had this study of energy storage technologies in the 70s that essentially said to focus entirely on these two applications. And so as a result, when utilities were deciding whether to build storage or not, they were likely undervaluing those investments. Now, today in the restructured world, in principle, we have price signals that should be guiding these types of storage investments. And so as a result, we can see utilities, generators, loads, or just standalone merchant storage operators popping into the market. And in fact, we have seen some evidence of this working. So we have about 23 megawatts of flywheel and battery storage plants that are in various stages of development in the New York ISO, about a megawatt in PJM. And what we've seen is that most of the active deployment of these technologies has been in restructured markets where there's actually a price signal associated with the regulation. That's kind of how the economic rationale of these investments has largely been based off of regulation service. And we've also seen some market design focus in this area in the past few years. So FERC has issued a couple of orders, one that's tailored towards ensuring that market tariffs actually allow provisions for storage. And then there was one more recently, about a year ago, which is trying to push the ISOs to actually differentiate prices that they pay to what they call faster response units. So the idea there is that a battery is probably better suited to provide regulation service than a coal plant is, and so the price that those two assets should get should reflect that difference in the quality of the service that you can get. And then as a result of this, we've actually seen storage-specific tariffs in some of these markets. So New York ISO and MISO, as two examples, have actually developed and have approved specific tariffs guided towards integrating storage devices into their markets. Now, despite the good news of having these price signals in restructured markets, there are still some, in some cases, inefficient or missing price signals related to some of the things that storage can do. So, as an example, congestion prices should, in principle, signal the need for either transmission relief that storage could provide, but there's no price signal at the distribution level. So that's an example of an application in which there's actually zero market exposure currently. End user services is another example of this. So unless end users actually have time variant rates, they don't have any market signals to actually put storage devices into place. Now, there are some examples that we've seen in which contracts can be designed or tailored to surmount some of these issues. So, as an example, there is a thermal energy storage developer based out of Colorado called Ice Energy, and they recently sold about 53 megawatts of distributed ice storage systems to some municipal utilities in Southern California. And the way that they made it work was that the munis actually own the storage systems and deploy them in the buildings of end users. And so because the utilities actually own them, the utilities are exposed to those wholesale market price differences, and so they have the proper price signal to use the storage devices in the proper way. But in principle, the end users may not actually have those price signals themselves to deploy those in place. Another example that I have here, power quality related services currently are not priced at all in the market due to extreme market powers. So that's another example in which storage could provide a service, but there's no price signal to actually indicate what you should do with it. Another issue is actual valuation of the benefits of storage. So even if we did have price signals in place, storage has this issue that it's an energy-constrained technology, and there are a lot of different things that you can do with it. So again, that's going back to those 7 broad categories of applications that I talked about. And so deciding what you actually do with your storage and when you do it really, in some sense, can make or break an investment. So there's been a lot of work looking at estimating arbitrage profits from storage, and there's a table down here that summarizes some numbers that people have come up with. The problem, if you look at those values, is that they're very low compared to the cost of storage. And so the only way that storage is really going to be economic with the cost that we have today is if we look at putting storage to multiple applications, trying to get these numbers higher than they are. And we don't really have good, robust models that can actually determine the operation, what you should do with your storage, and then on the basis of that, figure out how much is the asset actually worth. Regulatory issues, I think, has been a bit of a quagmire relating to storage. So the basic problem comes out of the history of the electricity industry. So despite the fact that we have these restructured markets, most of these restructured systems are still a hybrid between providing services in a market-based and a regulated manner. So just as an example, generation is in principle priced in the market, so there's a price signal to provide that. But as I said before, distribution, there's not a good price signal for that, and so that's a service that's largely provided on a regulated basis. And so we don't have a lot of precedence in this area, but a couple of recent FERC rulings seem to be moving in the direction of treating storage as either providing regulated or market-based services and then expecting the asset to recover all of its costs based on that classification. So I'm just going to run really quickly through two cases that point in this direction. So one is the LEAPS plant that was proposed in Southern California a couple years ago. The proposal was to build a 500 megawatt PHS plant in Southern California combined with a transmission corridor going between the SCE and SDG&E territories. And the developer proposed basically handing operational control of the LEAPS plant to the California ISO, and the ISO would dispatch the plant to maximize the transmission benefits that you would get from it. And what the developer asked for is, because the primary reason of building this plant was transmission relief, which is still largely a regulated service, they wanted to have the investments rate-based. Now, what the FERC decided in this case was that because the plant, the proposal was that it would be dispatched based on market-based energy price signals, there's no rationale, no reason to rate-base the investment. It should recover all of its costs in the market. Now, the other case that I'll contrast it with is the Western Grid case. This was also in California. It was a set of batteries that the developer wanted to build to provide voltage support and other transmission services. And the proposal was markedly different in that the developer said it was going to operate the batteries solely based on instructions that it would get from the CAISO. So similar to what the California ISO does with capacitors today. And so in principle, there's no market participation at all. This is just if California ISO sees that there's a voltage sag or spike, it would ask the battery to either be charged or discharged to provide active or reactive power. And so again, since this was primarily to provide transmission and distribution benefits, the developer asked for rate basing of the investment. And so in this case, we actually had the FERC allowing rate basing of the investment, and they said specifically it's because these services were going to be provided in an out-of-market basis. So just the last takeaway that I'll say based on this is that the precedents and the direction that we're going in seem to suggest that storage either has to do purely regulated activities and get the rate base, or it has to go into the market and recover its costs entirely there. And so in some sense, this almost guarantees that you're going to see inefficient storage investment and use, because if storage would be economic doing both a combination of regulated and market-based activities, you can't actually see it be built because it's not going to be able to recover all of the values associated with those services. And then on the flip side, if you do purely regulated activities with your storage, you're going to lose any potential value associated with market-based services. And this was actually an objection that the ISO raised in the Western Grid case. They said, why should ratepayers pay for batteries that are not going to do everything that they could potentially do in the market? And so this seems to be a little bit of a ugly dichotomy that FERC has gotten itself into. It seems to recognize it because it's asked for comments on proposals of alternative ways to go forward. One possibility might be to adopt an open access model that FERC currently applies to natural gas and sort of auctioning off tracts of storage capacity. So I'll skip these comments on risk mitigation in the interest of time. The biggest sort of non-technical issues in my mind that storage faces are developing robust operational and valuation models implementing actual market tariffs that are flexible enough to allow for self-scheduling of storage, and then cleaning up this regulatory mess that we seem to be headed towards, or the FERC seems to be headed towards. The last caveat that I'll mention is that even if these issues do get resolved, storage isn't necessarily the great story or the slam dunk that people make it out to be. And that's because at the end of the day, the technology still has to compete against other technologies and solutions. So one example could be demand response. And for example, if you resolve some of the pricing issues related to storage, well, those pricing issues also provide a price signal for demand response, and so it could make that a more attractive alternative. All right?